So, how do you hold two big ideas at the same time? How can you be full of unwavering truth and sacrificial grace without one just canceling out the other? Well, today we're breaking down a sermon that dives right into that very conflict. It introduces this really powerful concept called holy love to explain what happens when a community starts to lose its way and maybe, just maybe, how it can find its way back.
To really get to the heart of the problem, the sermon doesn't actually open with scripture. Nope, it starts with a story, and it's a fantastic metaphor for what happens when any group, really, loses its identity. It all begins with a church and a sign that's seen better days.
I want you to just picture a small church where the sign out front is so worn down, all it says is, blank of love. And when you ask an older member what it used to say, they just kind of shrug and admit nobody really remembers. Was it the fellowship of love? The house of love? They had just forgotten. And that empty space on the sign, well, that illustrates the core problem perfectly.
That story kind of forces a question that applies to any group, right? What kind of love do people see when they look inside? Is it just a warm, fuzzy feeling? Is it a love that comes with a bunch of conditions? The sermon uses this whole idea to diagnose a real crisis that was happening in the community it was addressing, one that was seriously fracturing over who is in and who is out.
And here's a really critical piece of context you got to know. The biblical text this whole sermon is built on, 1 John chapter 4. It wasn't written to convince outsiders to join. It was an urgent message for the insiders, people who already believed, but as the speaker puts it, were actively failing at love.
So how do you fix a blank of love? Well, the sermon argues you have to go back and rebuild it from its most basic ingredients. And the first ingredient it lays down, well, it probably isn't the one you'd expect.
The sermon zooms in on this super important detail in the original text. The author talks about truth before he even gets to the topic of love. The argument here is that you really can't have one without the other, but truth has to come first. It's like the foundation that real, genuine love has to be built on.
And we're not just talking about any kind of love here. The specific Greek word that's used is agape, and it's got nothing to do with, simple affection or being attracted to someone. The sermon defines it as a love that starts in the very will and nature of God. A love that is completely focused on seeking the good of others, no matter how much it costs you personally.
And to really drive home that cost, the speaker just puts it very, very plainly. Agape love cost Jesus everything. So this isn't some cheap or easy feeling. It's a love that is sacrificial to its absolute core, and it's defined not by what it gets, but by what it is willing to give up.
Okay, so this brings us to these three pillars that the sermon says have to stand together. First, you've got grace, which reaches out to everybody. Then, there's truth, which sets the standard. And finally, love, which is really the ultimate goal of it all. The sermon's core argument is that these aren't just, optional add-ons. If you try to remove even one of them, the whole structure just comes crashing down.
And that leads us to the sermon's central conflict. Now, to describe it, the speaker uses a very charged term, but then completely reframes it. See, this isn't about some person or a mythical beast, but about a kind of counterfeit attitude that can rise up in any of us. So when the scripture mentions the spirit of the Antichrist, the sermon makes it super clear it's not talking about a person, but a mindset. It's any attitude that stands in direct opposition to that self-giving, costly agape love of the cross. It's a distortion that, the speaker warns, can very easily take root right inside the walls of the church.
And you can really see that contrast laid out here. On one side, you have the Spirit of Christ, where grace, truth, and love are all united. But then on the other side, you see the counterfeit, these broken pillars of truth without love or trying to get power without holiness. One builds people up, and the other just tears them down.
So, what does this counterfeit attitude actually look like in real life? Well, the sermon gives some really concrete examples. It's things like wanting the blessing without being willing to take on the burden. It's cherry-picking scripture to make it say what you want it to say. It's loving only the people who are easy to love. It's all about holding on to control instead of practicing that self-giving love.
Okay, so after identifying the problem, laying out the stakes, where does this sermon point for a solution? Well, it proposes this powerful fusion of two ideas that, let's be honest, often seem to be in conflict with each other: holiness and love.
And this, right here, is the sermon's big idea: holy love. The argument is that these two concepts are basically incomplete without each other. Think about it. Holiness, a commitment to truth and moral integrity, that can become really harsh and judgmental if it's not softened by love. But love, if it doesn't have that foundation of holiness, just becomes shallow and sentimental. They have to be fused into one.
And this isn't just some private feeling you're supposed to have. The sermon really drives home the point that true holiness is social. It has to be visible out in the real world and how we actually treat other people. It's about, as the speaker says, the truth of God taking on skin in our actions.
Okay, so we've got the theory down, but how do you actually put it into practice? Well, the sermon doesn't just leave you hanging. It ends with 3 very direct, very tangible challenges to help make all these big ideas personal.
And here they are, those 3 challenges. First, to take inventory, to look back honestly at your own growth. Second, to identify, where might some of those counterfeit attitudes be showing up in your own thinking? And third, to imagine, what could actually become possible in a life or in a community that is truly defined by this complete, holy love.
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. This sermon? Yeah, it's rooted in a specific faith tradition, but its call to action is a powerful exercise in self-reflection for anyone. What could any of us learn by taking an honest inventory of our actions, identifying our own counterproductive attitudes, and just imagining the impact of living more fully by our deepest values? It's a question worth considering.